Here is Monteverde Key Lime Pie, a green ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is a perfectly named ink. It makes me really want to head down to Key West for the weekend just for some pie. And this All-Star, is this a great color match or what? Now, this is a fairly consistent tone across all papers. It does shade just a little bit, but I don't see this as a main color on the page just because of how bright a green it is. So I would forego a bottle unless you really like this as a second color on the page. I think it's a great ink, but a whole page of it is a bit much. The pen for today is a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Just looking at this tone makes you really want to slice a pie. Truly, it does. It's not feathering and it's not spreading. It does have those little areas of shading that do become evident when you're looking at it, like the E of become on the second line, the end of the K of took on the first line, the E at abode on the first line. You frequently get this darker letter towards the end of a word. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, you see we have no bleeding, no ghosting, no surprises that you could continue writing back here. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Monteverde Joy Sepia. Here is Monteverde Malibu Blue. Here is Monteverde Mandarin Orange. Here is Monteverde Mercury Noir. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It shades less than it did on the Clairfontaine, though there are some areas that you can see it, most noticeably with the on the first line. But for the most part, you're getting that very key lime green in all of this writing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Here we have the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not being affected by the tone of the paper, which means we have a bit more of an opaque ink, even though it's very light. However, the tone of the paper does make this less appealing to look at. Even though it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it shades about as well as it did on the Portage, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does show up from time to time. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It shades just as often as it did on the Clairfontaine, but we're looking at this for how it stands out against the quad rule. And unfortunately, I feel like it's losing that battle. Not that the vertical lines are cutting the ink. It's doing well, showing that it's very opaque. It's that the tone is getting lost in the quad rule, really making this not the best pairing for this ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, their number 27. Here is Ancient Charm on the Love of Lotus. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Forbes Field Green. Here is Bookbinder's Emerald Boa Snake. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, this paper usually does mute and ink a little bit, and it's really not doing that here. Same tone. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It definitely shades less than it did on the Clairfontaine, and this ink is still losing the battle against the quad rule. I don't know that this is a really good match for a student to use in their lab notebook, because it could be a little bit harder to read. That being said, this might make a good second color for them to use. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem, because we can continue our notes here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Diamine Coral. Here is Organic Studios Jane Austen Violet. Here is Tasha Kuro. Here is Sailor Kobe number 4. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Sure, it feathers a little bit. Sure, it spreads a little bit. Not a problem for this ink, especially being that it's very light. It's very, unless you're used to looking for it, you're probably not even going to notice it. Though if you look at before on the first line, you kind of see it a little there. Not really any kind of a big deal. Stays a very good usable ink here. There's 1 or 2 moments of shading that you might notice, like the middle of 14th on the third line, where it does darken just a hair. Looking at the back of the page, we see it gets fairly deep into the paper, as to be expected when you're using. So I don't know about writing back here. I do think that if you wrote on the back, you ruin both sides of the notes just because of how deep it does get. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This Dry Broad All-Star is such a great color match. It gives a fun tone on the page and a little bit of shading. Now, off camera, I tried a wet fine, and it didn't change this tone very much. Not enough to really matter. And the thinner lines didn't help it in readability. So for that, I don't think that the flow of the pen matters. I would probably avoid fine or stub nibs with this pen just because it does get a little bit harder to read. And to keep it easy to read, I would stay with either a broad or a medium. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.